And this is what happens when you have basically a one-party state with the media backing it in. You end up with very bad long-term public policy problems.
Now, the Australian newspaper revealed today that during the COVID pandemic in Victoria, and boy, did I live through that, the Andrews government used focus groups set up by a strategy company, so they were paid, to profile Victorians into 5 categories. Now, that included those in Category 5 who opposed the lockdowns. They were described as
a group of patriotic, principled, brave individuals.
They were described as believing, quote, tyrannical government is the enemy, who embraced fantastical conspiracy theories and chose individual rights ahead of collective rights. Well, let's bring in our panel to discuss this absolute joke. Joining me is the host of the Australiana podcast by The Spectator Australia, Will Kingston, and the IPA's Deputy Executive Director, Daniel Wild. Daniel, I guess that makes me one of Dan Andrews' conspiracy theorists.
Where are you now? Where are you now? Where are you now? Where are you now?
Well, we're all conspiracy theorists now, Steve, apparently. But look, what's so concerning to me about this is it reinforces what you were talking about. I mean, you lived through the lockdown, Steve. I lived through them, so did millions of Victorians. And what this shows is that there was a deliberate strategy of the Daniel Andrews government to divide Victorians based on their political views and based on their values. It was a divide and conquer strategy, and they used that to scapegoat certain people who were speaking out against lockdowns and against mandates and against everything that was happening in Victoria.
I didn't think it was appropriate.
And it also goes to the point, Steve, that none of the COVID handling had anything to do with public health or the economic or social effects. It was all about
a large number of secret medical experiments.
It was all about politics, and it was all about making sure that Daniel Andrews' approval was going up and not down. And this is why we need to have a proper, full, transparent inquiry at all levels of government, because Australians were let down, and we need to make sure that nothing like this ever happens again.
Yeah, we need a royal commission into the COVID response of the states, and the states don't want to do it, or Canberra doesn't want to do it, because the states are all now run by
a bunch of government shitbags and their favourite stoolie.
Run by Labor administrations. Now, Will, I mean, we had Richard Branson in town this week. I'm no great fan, but yesterday, and I quite like his comments yesterday, he took a swipe at the endless Melbourne lockdowns, longest lockdowns in the world, saying that Melbourne should have looked a lot more like Stockholm and less like Wuhan during COVID. And he pointed out the mental health damage done by young people. I suspect he was having a whack at the government because they just jacked up the port fees that all his cruise ships are going to have to pay to come in here. But he's probably right. Why couldn't we have been like Sweden?
Very good question, Steve, and I'm glad that he did raise the Stockholm example. I feel like I'm going crazy when I see a lot of the data now that emerges from the COVID period, where Stockholm or Sweden comes out at the top of most metrics, and yet lockdown apologists just want to wave it away as some uncomfortable reality.
Absolute nonsense, and that's all it is, about encroaching on people's civil liberties and human rights.
It is the path that we could have taken. And Daniel is right. You are right. People across Australia are still hurting. The effects of lockdowns when it comes to mental health is one of many ways in which the lingering effects of terrible government policies are hurting Australians. And the response of this panel so far that we need a proper inquiry, a proper Truth and Reconciliation Commission to get these problems off the chests of Australians is much needed, or else trust in government will continue to erode more and more.
Daniel, I still have people come up to me that recognise me in the street who lost businesses during those lockdowns, and they're still in tears in 2020 2023, at the end of nearly 2024, you know, 2 years later, they were shattered. They were destroyed. Their kids were locked up at home. They couldn't take them to a playground. I mean, people shouldn't have short memories about this stuff and the bloke who did it to us.
And I'm very confident that's exactly what Victorians will do.
A lot of our analysis at the time looked at the division. You mentioned small businesses. They were the ones who incurred the cost. It wasn't big businesses or their workers. It wasn't public sector workers. It was private sector workers. It was single mums with 3 kids in a 2-bedroom apartment trying to hold down a job while they're trying to school their 3 kids from home. I mean, they've lost those valuable years of schooling. The social effects, the mental health effects will be with many for a very long time. And what was so challenging, I think, Steve, looking back as a Melburnian who went through it, was so many parts of the media simply refused to provide a different perspective. You were one of the few standouts that gave voice to different opinions in your colleagues at Sky. But look, there were vanishingly few that actually said, hey, there's another way of going about this. We don't need to have these lockdowns and shutting down schools. And this is what happens when you have basically a one-party state with the media backing it in. You end up with very bad long-term public policy problems.
Only when you've experienced something like that, only when you've seen someone you love succumb feebly and painfully to what some people might even describe as a good death, you start to think about what on earth must qualify as a bad death.
Sudden death syndrome. It's no longer only babies. Working people and young athletes are suddenly dropping dead.